Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we're looking down. Not at the surface, not at the horizon, below it. See, there was a moment not too long ago where the entire world was watching the ocean. Not the waves, not the depth. A number. An oxygen counter, hours ticking down. A small space isolated somewhere far below the surface. And for a while, that number became the story. But the ocean around it stayed the same. Vast, silent, unmeasured. It's strange how easily something that large can be reduced to something small enough to track. A timer, a location, a point on a map. And everything else just disappears into the dark. The ocean is pretty easy to understand from the surface, right? You can stand at the edge and take it all in. Waves moving in patterns. Light reflecting off the top of it. A horizon that feels distant but still familiar. There's motion, but it's motion that makes sense. There's depth, but you don't feel it. Not really. From that vantage point, the ocean feels like something you can look at, something you can enter and leave. Something that exists within your frame. But that changes quickly. Not miles out necessarily, just down. A few feet below the surface, the light starts to shift. Colors fade. Movement becomes less defined. Sound behaves differently. It travels farther. It carries in a way that's more difficult to track. The deeper that you go, the more those familiar reference points fall away. Light disappears faster. Then distances become harder to judge. And then direction. Eventually, there's no clear sense of up or down without something to anchor you. And all of that happens long before you reach what we would call the deep ocean. Because depth isn't just distance. It's pressure. Every layer you move through adds a little bit of weight. Not in a way that you can feel on the surface, but in a way that builds constantly, quietly. There's no moment where it announces itself, it just increases steadily. At certain depths, the pressure becomes difficult to imagine in practical terms. It's not just more anymore. It's a different kind of environment entirely. One that the human body isn't built to exist in. Not without protections, not without some kind of boundary. That boundary doesn't even have to be very large, just a few inches of material. A sealed space. Something that holds back the water. And as long as that boundary holds, everything inside feels normal. Air you can breathe. Pressure that your body understands. movement that makes sense. It doesn't feel like you're surrounded by anything unusual. That's the part that's easy to forget. The environment outside doesn't change how the inside feels. Until it does. And when it does, there isn't a transition. There isn't time to adjust. The difference between those two states is immediate. That's why the ocean can feel both distant and close at the same time. From the surface, it looks open, expansive, something you can explore. But beneath it, it becomes something very different. Not necessarily hostile in an active way, not necessarily aggressive, just incompatible. It doesn't need to do anything to you. It just exists in a way that doesn't allow for you to exist within it. And that's where the scale becomes really difficult to fathom, because that environment isn't rare. It's not a small portion of the ocean. It's most of it. We spend our time on the surface, in the narrow band where pressure, light, and air line up in a way that works for us. Everything below that is something we interact with indirectly, through instruments, through brief visits, through controlled environments that allow us to enter and then leave. And even then, the experience is very limited, because the deeper you go, the less there is to orient yourself. No landmarks, no consistent light, just space and pressure and time. That's where perception starts to shift. Not because something appears, but because the absence of familiar structure forces your mind to adapt. You can't rely on distance the same way. You can't rely on sound the same way. You can't rely on movement the same way. Everything you use to understand space starts to behave differently. And in that environment, small things take on more significance. A sound carries farther than expected. A movement feels closer than it should. A shadow doesn't resolve into something recognizable. The mind starts to fill in the gaps. Not because it wants to, but because it has to. We don't do well with undefined space. We look for edges, for shapes, for something to anchor to. And when those things are not available, we create them. We assign meaning. We place objects. We build a sense of where we are, even if that sense isn't entirely accurate. That process isn't unique to the ocean, but the ocean amplifies it because of the scale, because of the pressure, because of how quickly familiar cues disappear. And that brings things back to the surface, back to how we usually think about the ocean. We don't think about the full depth. We focus on specific points. A location, a vessel, maybe a set of coordinates, something we can measure, track, follow. There was a moment where the world did exactly that. Attention narrowed to a single number. Time remaining. Air available. A countdown that could be watched in real time. It gave the situation structure. Something to hold on to. Something to understand. But that number existed inside something much larger. A space that couldn't be measured the same way. A depth that doesn't translate into a countdown. And while attention stayed fixed on that number, the environment around it remained unchanged. We're going to talk more about this when we come back. Let us know what you think about all this in the comments below. please reach out to us on our hotline, 402-610-2836. This is the Midnight Drive. When you're that deep in the ocean, it's silent. It's pressurized. It's expansive beyond what you can hold in a single frame. And that's a really, really hard thing to sit with, isn't it? Because it shows how we process scale. We reduce it. We compress it into something manageable. A number, a map, a point. And everything outside of it becomes background. Even when that background is the majority of the space. Even when the background is what defines the situation. That's not a failure, it's how we function. We focus on what we can understand, what we can track, what we can follow. But every now and then, there's a moment where the scale breaks through, where you realize that what you're looking at is only a small part of something much, much larger. Something that doesn't fit neatly into a frame. And the ocean is one of the clearest examples of that. Not because it's mysterious in a dramatic sense, but just because it's there. It exists. It's constant. It covers most of the planet, existing in layers that we rarely experience directly. It's beautiful on the surface, calm even, but beneath that, a completely different environment, one that doesn't change for us, one that doesn't adjust to us. It just remains. And the deeper you go, the less of it you can bring back into something familiar. Until eventually, you reach a point where the only thing you find left to hold on to is the awareness of how little of it you actually understand. See, there's something else that happens when you start thinking about the ocean this way. It stops feeling like a place and starts feeling like a boundary. Not a line that you can see, not something marked on a map, but a literal limit, a point where human experience begins to just fall off. On the surface, we move easily. We build. We travel. We measure distance in ways that make sense. We operate inside systems that we understand. Even when things are complex, they're still within reach, still within a frame we can work inside of. But the deeper you go, the less that holds. Not gradually, noticeably. There's a point where exploration becomes something else. Not walking through a space, not even swimming through it. More like visiting, briefly, with supports and with structure. And always with the understanding that you cannot stay. That shift changes how we relate to it. We don't think of the deep ocean as somewhere we live, or even somewhere we fully explore. We think of it as somewhere we can technically reach. Sometimes, under the right conditions. That distance creates a kind of separation. It makes it easier to ignore, easier to treat as background. Something that exists, but doesn't directly affect the way we move through the world. But every now and then, something brings it back into focus. Not the full scale of it, just a point, a moment, a location that draws attention to itself. And when that happens, the way we process it becomes very clear. We look for something to follow, some kind of timeline or a signal, a detail that gives the situation some kind of a shape. In that moment, the vastness seems to disappear. Not because it's gone, because it's too large to hold all at once. So we compress it. We compress it down into something that we can understand. We narrow it down to something manageable, a single point in a space that doesn't really have edges. That compression is useful. It lets us focus. It lets us respond. But it also changes how the situation feels because it removes the context. It removes the scale. And what's left is something that feels contained, understandable, trackable, even when it isn't. That's where the tension comes in, because the reality underneath that point hasn't changed. The environment is still there, unmeasured in most directions, unseen beyond a certain distance, operating under conditions we can't exist in. And that doesn't shift just because we found something to focus on. It stays the same. It's quiet. It's unmoving in the ways that matter. It's indifferent. That word gets used a lot, but it fits here. Not because the ocean is actively anything, but because it doesn't respond. It doesn't adjust based on who is there or what they need. It doesn't scale itself to human experience. It remains consistent. And that consistency is what makes it feel so distant from the way we live. We're used to environments that change with us. Temperature, light, sound. We adapt them. We control them. We shape them to fit our needs. But the deeper parts of the ocean don't allow for that. They exist outside of that kind of interaction, which means that anytime we enter that space, we're the ones adapting. We're the ones bringing structure with us. Pressure-resistant materials, controlled air, artificial light. We create a version of the surface inside something small enough to hold. And as long as that structure holds, everything feels stable, contained, safe, in a relative sense. But that safety isn't coming from the environment, it's coming from the separation, from the barrier between two states that don't mix. And that barrier is always present, always doing the same job, holding back something that doesn't need to push. That idea is easy to overlook when everything is functioning the way it's supposed to. When the system works, when the boundary holds, because the experience inside doesn't reflect what's outside. You can sit in a controlled space, surrounded by pressure. That would otherwise make survival impossible and still feel normal. Still feel like you're in a room, like you're moving through something familiar. That contrast is what makes the ocean so difficult to fully grasp, because the human experience of it is always filtered, always contained within something that makes it manageable. We don't experience it directly. We experience a version of it that's been adjusted to fit within our limits. And that's true in a broader sense as well, not just physically, perceptually. We take something vast and reduce it. We take something complex and simplify it. We create frames that allow us to interact with it without having to hold the weight of what it actually is. That process isn't unique to the ocean, but the ocean exposes it in a very clear way because the difference between the frame and the reality is so large. It's so immediate. You can stand on the shore and feel like you understand it. You can look out, see the surface, the motion, the horizon. You can assign meaning to it based on what's visible. But that understanding only goes so far, because most of it isn't visible. Most of it exists outside of that frame, below it, beyond it, in a space that doesn't translate easily into something we can hold on to. And yet, it's part of the same system, the same planet, the same environment that we live in, which creates a strange kind of disconnect. We're surrounded by something we only partially understand, something that shapes the world in ways we don't always see directly, something that exists alongside us, but not within our experience. A reminder that what we focus on isn't always the full picture.